Hello, welcome back to the transformation of the global system. I am Dr. Nicole Warmington Granston. Today we'll be looking at global actors. First, looking at governance and also the role of non-state actors. With that, we will be basically covering, what is international law, global governance, the role of the United Nations, international organizations, and the growing importance of global actors beyond nation states. So we'll explore UN institutions, peacekeeping, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and debates about UN reform. Of course, this will be followed by looking at non-state actors and their growing influence in global politics and governance. So we'll examine multinational corporations or MNCs, NGOs and INGOs. We'll talk about civil society, transnational advocacy networks, social movements, and criminal networks. So we're going to be looking at, in this section, where global politics is no longer controlled by states because non-state actors increasingly shape public policy, global governance, economics, human rights, and international norms. So let's start off by defining what is international law. Now, international law is a system of norms, rules, and practices created by states to regulate international relations. The main goal of international law is peace, order, coexistence, justice, and human development. You find that states develop international law as an alternative to war for resolving disputes. So we're seeing where international law attempts to create stability and cooperation between states. Now, how is international law formed? Now, it's formed on the idea of multilateral diplomacy. International law is created through the cooperation among states. The key features include cooperation between three or more countries or states, agreements creating binding rules. Third, states are expected to obey the rules that they have consented to, and that there is also customary behavior that can also become binding law. So we find that consent and cooperation are central to international law. Now let's talk about international institutions. What are they? International institutions are systems of norms and principles that influence state behavior. There are actually three main types of international institutions. We have deep constitutional institutions, which are the foundational principles of international politics, such as the idea or the concept of sovereignty. There are fundamental institutions where rules and practices are that help to organize state cooperation, such as international law and multilateralism. And then there's also issue-specific institutions that are institutions that focus on particular issues, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Fisheries Organizations. Now let's define international organizations. International organizations are those that involve members from different states. It may also include private organizations as well. But we know that there's actually about four main types of international organizations. You have military organizations, such as NATO. We have economic international organizations in the form of the European Union, We have regional organizations, such as the Caribbean Community or CARICOM, which constitutes the English-speaking Caribbean countries, or as we could think about ASEAN, that is made up of the Southeast Asian nations. And then you also have the historical or cultural Commonwealth nations, such as, which I just mentioned before. The Commonwealth are those that are countries that are part of the former British colonies. So as I said, when you think about international organizations, you have international governmental organizations or IGOs that are led by states. And then you have international non-governmental organizations that tend to be run by private individuals or groups. Now let's talk about the evolution of international law and our movement towards that of global governance. I forgot to make this point that the purpose of IGOs are to promote cooperation, enhance diplomacy, improve security, coordinate economic and social policies. So we find that IOs will help states manage shared global problems. So as I'm going on now to talk about state-centered politics to global governance, we know that traditional international law mainly focused on states, sovereignty, and interstate order. However, we've seen a shift towards global governance. Over the last 30 years, governance has expanded to include non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations or MNCs, the global media, social movements, and even global markets. But what is global governance? Now, global governance can be defined as referring to the systems, rules, and actors that manage global issues. Some of the key features include cooperation beyond states, shared management of global problems, increased interdependence, and a focus on sustainable development. As such, we know that global governance is broader than just governments. So let's look at the most recognized international organization that is out there, that of the United Nations. Now, the United Nations was created in 1945 after the World War II as an improvement over the League of Nations. Its main goals are to maintain peace and security, promote friendly relations, encourage cooperation, and protect human rights. Now, the main organs of the United Nations or the UN are the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Secretariat, the Economic and Social Council, the Trustee Council, and the International Court of Justice. So let's look at the Security Council, which is said to be the main or definitely a major organization within the United Nations. Now, the Security Council is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. There are actually 5 permanent members, which include the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Each have a veto power. Now, why did this permanent member structure exist? It's because the system reflects that of military power, political influence, and post-World War II realities. Now, there is actually some tension here because as we become more interdependent and we're moving towards global governance, that there's a tension between equality of representation in the Security Council versus that of great power privilege. So we know that the Security Council powers would include mediating disputes, imposing sanctions, authorizing peacekeeping, and approving military action. So they're in charge of organizing ceasefires, putting forward arms embargoes, and even going out and putting out peacekeeping missions. Now, we should know that a peacekeeping mission, the main thing or purpose of it is to maintain a truce and to separate opposing powers. However, success is difficult to measure because operations are complex and multidimensional. The next major organization of the United Nations is that of the General Assembly. Now, the main features are as follows. All member states participate. Every state has one vote. They discuss global issues such as migration, trade, and human rights. And you find that a major limitation of the General Assembly is that most resolutions are non-binding. So states don't necessarily have to follow the resolutions that they tend to pass. Then we have the UN Secretariat as another major organ of the United Nations. And the role is to handle all the administrative work of the United Nations. We find that it is led by a Secretary General, and it actually has a special power that under Article 99, the Secretary General may refer threats to peace to the Security Council. Next, we'll look at the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, as some call it. The main function of this council is to coordinate economic and social activities within the United Nations. The main area of focus tend to be that of development, women's rights, climate change, health, and poverty reduction. The main examples of institutions within or agencies under ECOSOC are the World Health Organization, the United Nations Children's Fund, and the United Nations Development Program. Next, we have the Trustee Council. Now, the main purpose of the Trustee Council was to oversee trust territories transitioning towards democracy. Now, its current status is, largely inactive after decolonization was completed. Then we have the International Court of Justice. Now, the main function of the International Court of Justice is to settle disputes between states. We find that only states can bring cases before the ICJ. We find that participation is voluntary and decisions are binding if states accept its jurisdiction. It also has an additional role where it provides advisory opinions to UN bodies. Now, some major limitations of the ICJ are that states can refuse its jurisdiction, enforcement is limited, and you find that national laws may override corporation claims. So this kind of gives us an understanding that these international courts depend heavily on state consent. So with that, we can identify some major roles of, or should I say major functions of the United Nations. These would include peacekeeping, human rights promotion, conflict resolution or mediation, development assistance, sanctions, international law, humanitarian support, and encouraging self-determination. So some major criticisms against the United Nations are as follows. One, that it has limited power. You find that state sovereignty limits UN effectiveness. Second, that of Western bias. Critics argue that the UN reflects Western interests. Third, the Security Council problems. The permanent 5 structure is said to be very outdated. And the fourth one is that there tends to be a weak response to global problems. See, global Now, when looking at it, some reform proposals for the Security Council, for instance, there has been suggestions include adding permanent seats for countries such as India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and a few African countries. When we look at ECOSOC, some reform proposals are as follows. That the goals should be that of reducing duplication between the different sub-organs, improving coordination, and strengthening monetary systems. Then, when we look at those are the main proposals. So I want to look at some other major IOs in global governance. And I'll be kind of talking largely about the International Criminal Court and some regional organizations such as the European Union. So when we talk about the International Criminal Court, it was actually created in 1998, and the main function was to try individuals accused of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Now, the key difference between the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice is that the International Criminal Court that I'm talking about now tries individuals, while the International Court of Justice handles disputes between states. When we look at regional organizations, we find that regionalism is defined as the growth of regional organizations that have increased after the Cold War. When looking at how the European Union developed, we saw that the European integration saw the European Union moving first from being the European Coal and Steel Community, then evolving to the European Economic Community, And then they signed the Maastricht Treaty, that led to the European Union being formed. We see that, there is a paradox when we think about European integration because there's two approaches to it. It provides supranationalism, where you find that some powers move beyond the states because there's organizations within the EU that are above the states and make final decisions. And then there's also intergovernmentalism, where states remain dominant. So when looking at global governance, or the idea of governance, is that global governance involves states and many non-state actors, that the UN is the central institution of global governance, and that international organizations help to manage global problems, but face criticisms and reform pressures. So some terms I want to leave today, this part of the discussion with, is that of international law, global governance, sovereignty, multilateralism, peacekeeping, Security Council, veto power, the ICJ, the ICC, regionalism, and global interdependence. So with this, we understand that global governance reflects the growing need of international cooperation in a world where challenges increasingly cross national borders. Next, as I said, we'll be looking at that of what we call non-state actors. So as I said before, what are non-state actors? So non-state actors, if we're to define this particular term, are entities that participate in international relations but are not official state institutions. They influence issues such as human rights, social justice, global commerce, environmental protection, and territorial issues. The main idea is that even without sovereign authority, you find that non-state actors can still influence global political outcomes. Now, what are the main types of non-state actors? The main types of non-state actors are multinational corporations, or MNCs. Some call them transnational corporations. Then we have international non-governmental organizations, or INGOs, foundations and think tanks, individuals, global civil society, transnational advocacy networks, and transnational social movements and criminal networks. Now, why do transnational actors matter? Well, we find that NSAs, or some scholars abbreviate them, are considered to be new actors in global politics. Their influence includes influencing governments, shaping public policy, affecting international law, and mobilizing global opinion. We find that business decisions and even private actors can actually pressure governments into action. So what we will get from this is that you find that power in global politics is now shared between state and non-state actors, right? So we find that NSAs are active in three major areas. You have the global commons issues, where they will focus on climate change, biodiversity, and ocean pollution. They are concerned with human security issues, such as health, education, human rights, war, and repression. And you also find that they're focused on governance. So they attempt to influence international institutions, reform international law, and shape global governance. So we're going to start looking at each of these major actors in more detail. So we're going to start by looking at multinational corporations. Now, multinational corporations are those that operate production and services in more than one country. The main features include operating across borders, managing international production networks, and depending on global markets. The role of MNCs are as follows. They are actually viewed as the engines of economic growth. So their key roles would be that of promoting globalization, expanding international production, moving capital globally, and strengthening economic integration. So we see how companies can influence the global economy beyond national borders. But what are the theoretical perspectives on MNCs? So we know that the liberals actually think MNCs are positive because they improve efficiency, support free markets, and encourage economic interdependence. They see economic integration being able to promote peace, which of course is necessary to ensure that there's no wars or any other insecurities. Then we have the realist view that sees MNCs as a tool of national power. The MNCs benefit powerful states or home states more than the weaker host states. And then we have the Marxist view, which is the structural or the dependency theorist view, that argue that MNCs exploit poor countries, reinforce global inequality, and create dependency. Now, what role do we see MNCs playing in global politics? And the main role is through what we know as the World Economic Forum, right? The World Economic Forum meets every January, and they connect governments, corporations, and global elites together. The main function of the World Economic Forum is to actually promote public-private cooperation, and they discuss global risks, trade, finance, and technology. Now, let's talk about INGOs, or international non-governmental organizations. What are they? So international non-governmental organizations are private voluntary organizations whose members work together towards common goals. Its main characteristics are that they have cross-border operations, they're shared global interests, they focus on cooperation and advocacy, and can be grassroots or large transnational organizations. So the main purpose of these INGOs are to bring people together across national boundaries. There's actually said to be four main types of INGOs. So we have the religious NGOs, where some religious groups historically has actually helped to shape international politics and conflict. We have human rights NGOs, and these human rights NGOs, for example, such as Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch, they tend to monitor human rights abuses, influence governments, and advocate for reforms. We also have aid institutions like the Peace Corps and aid workers in conflict areas. Next, we'll talk about experts, networks, and partnerships. Why do they exist in global governance? We've seen where global governance has increasingly depended on these experts, partnerships, and collaborative networks. The main reason being is that we found that global problems are too complex, for states to solve alone. Then next we have the global civil society and social movements. Now, what are social movements? They're said to be large networks of people seeking social and political change. Their main focus tend to be that of environmental protection, democracy, social justice, and human rights. There are said to be three main types of civil society organizations at the global level. You have the conformist CSOs that support the current system. You have the reformist CSOs that seek reforms within the system. And then you have the transformist/rejectionist CSOs that want to replace the current global order. So we know from this setup that not all NGOs or movements share the same political goals. Then, of course, we'll talk about transnational criminal networks. Now, globalization has actually strengthened criminal organizations. Examples of these organizations are drug cartels, mafia groups, and terrorist organizations. You find that the main concern is that they create new security threats beyond the traditional interstate conflict. So what are the main functions of NGOs and non-state actors? There's actually said before, or some would say 8 functions. These would include advocacy, where they promote policies and political participation. It also they promote mobilization, where they organize public opinion and activism. For example, the Greenpeace campaigns in the past. They provide humanitarian assistance, where they provide aid during disasters and refugee crisis. And Oxfam is a famous NSA NGO that does this. They also monitor and provide accountability, where it is that you'd find that they will track human rights abuses, they will look into environmental violations and even governmental behavior. Now, what is the power or the main source of powers for these non-state actors? The main source of power is really that they rely largely on soft power. So they rely on expertise, moral authority, and credible information. Some of the advantages in this is that they are politically independent, they're flexible, they can work across borders, and they're less constrained by national politics. Now, what are some of the limitations of these non-state actors? The main problems is one, limited funding. You find that most NGOs or NSAs lack stable economic resources. Second, there may be some dependence on governments where state funding can reduce neutrality and legitimacy. Third, there could be a lack of accountability. Some critics question NGO and NSA effectiveness and representation. And then there's also the unintended consequences where some activities may unintentionally prolong conflicts. Now, what are some of the theoretical views of the importance or the positive negative role that NSAs play? You find that the realists basically argue that they're very skeptical of NGOs and international organizations because they believe that states still control legal authority and remain dominant actors. Then we have the radical Marxist perspective, where the critics argue that NGOs and NSAs are often dominated by wealthy northern elites or Western elites and reflect unequal global power structures. Then we have the constructivist school that sees NGOs as norm entrepreneurs, meaning that they spread new international norms and influence state behavior. And then finally, we have the liberal perspective. And the liberals believe that non-state actors encourage cooperation, strengthen collective action, and expand political participation. So some main takeaways I want to take from this section is as follows. Non-state actors increasingly shape global politics and governance. NGOs, MNCs, and social movements influence policy, economics, and international norms, and non-state actors can both solve and create global problems. Important terms to remember are that of non-state actors, MNCs, NGOs or INGOs, the global civil society, advocacy networks, social movements, soft power, global governance, dependency, and neoliberal globalization. With that, I'll end this section by stating that in today's interconnected world, global politics is shaped not only by states, but also by powerful networks of corporations, NGOs, activists, and transnational movements. Thank you.